Blackridge, Wyoming. From a distance, it looked like a postcard from a forgotten time. One main street, a little white church with paint that was starting to chip. But the folks who called Blackridge home knew a secret. Peace is a lot easier to keep when everyone agrees not to talk about certain things. 15 years ago, a gallows stood in the northern field, a dark silhouette against the big Wyoming sky. Its shadow was longer and colder than anyone wanted to admit. Officially, it was dismantled after a small electrical fire. Officially, nothing important ever happened there. And officially, no one had ever died on it. But some things you can't just erase. The ground remembers. October morning, as the sun was just starting to paint the sky, a dusty pickup truck rolled into town. It didn't speed, didn't hesitate. The wind whipped at his coat, trying to push him back towards the highway. But he didn't seem to notice. It didn't speed, didn't hesitate. The wind whipped at his coat, trying to push him back towards the highway. But he didn't seem to notice. It didn't speed, didn't hesitate. The wind whipped at his coat, trying to push him back towards the highway. But he didn't seem to notice. The question didn't echo, but it felt like it did. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. A man by the window started coughing. The waitress froze, her coffee pot hovering in midair. "We don't talk about that," she finally said, her voice tight. Aaron just nodded once, like that was the answer he was expecting. "I figured," he replied, and his calmness was more unsettling than any A man by the window started coughing. The waitress froze, her coffee pot hovering in midair. "We don't talk about that," she finally said, her voice tight. Aaron just nodded once, like that was the answer he was expecting. "I figured," he replied, and his calmness was more unsettling than any shout could have been. Curiosity asks questions loudly. Certainty asks them quietly. Within minutes, the news flew through Blackridge like a dry wind. By the time Aaron stepped back onto the street, he could feel eyes on him from behind drawn curtains. 3 old men across the street were pretending to inspect a broken mailbox, but their gazes were fixed on him. Aaron didn't look back. He just started walking north. The northern field was just an empty stretch of land, dry grass whispering against his boots. To anyone else, it was nothing. But to Aaron, it was a destination. A point on a map he had folded and unfolded 100 times until the creases were soft as cloth. He stopped on a slight rise in the ground, a place that felt different. Just then, he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. A wave of unease rippled through the small crowd. "That's just a story," someone muttered from the back. "Because innocent towns aren't afraid of shovels." The small crowd. "That's just a story," someone muttered from the back. "Because innocent towns aren't afraid of shovels." A wave of unease rippled through the small crowd. "That's just a story," someone muttered from the back. "Because innocent towns aren't afraid of shovels." "Story," someone muttered from the back. "Because innocent towns aren't afraid of shovels." That night, lights in Blackridge stayed on much later than usual. Phones rang. Worried conversations were had in hushed tones. The 3 elderly men from the street corner were in the mayor's living room, their voices low and tense. "He can't dig there. He doesn't have any proof." "He has something," one of them whispered, his voice shaky, "or he wouldn't have come." The next morning was cold and sharp. Aaron returned to the field. He carried only a shovel and a quiet, unshakable resolve. It seemed the entire town had gathered at a distance, a ring of silent spectators pretending they were just out for a morning walk. He broke the ground. The first shovel of dirt seemed to weigh more than just soil. It held 15 years of silence. 15 years of denial. He dug slowly, deliberately. He dug slowly, deliberately. Nailed to the underside was a small bundle wrapped in old, faded cloth. The mayor took an involuntary step back. Aaron freed the bundle and unwrapped it slowly, letting every single person watch, letting the reality sink in. Inside was a sheriff's badge. It was bent and dark. Aaron freed the bundle and unwrapped it slowly, letting every single person watch, letting the reality sink in. Inside was a sheriff's badge. It was bent and dark with age, but the engraving was still clear. Sheriff Thomas Hawley, Aaron's father. They hadn't just killed him, they had erased him. He looked straight at the mayor, his eyes locking onto him. One cold October morning, as the sun was just starting to... They had erased him. He looked straight at the mayor. He looked straight at the mayor, his eyes locked at the mayor, his eyes locking onto him. His eyes locking onto him. One cold... "You didn't just hang my father," he said, his voice still quiet, but now it cut like glass. "You erased him." No one said a word. The ground of Blackridge was finally giving back the secrets the town had tried so desperately to bury. Aaron's gaze swept across the faces in the crowd, fear, guilt, denial, all mixed together. Then he asked the one question nobody was ready to answer. So, who ordered the hanging? And for the first time in 15 years, the silence in Blackridge was louder than any confession could ever be. What happens when a town's dark past comes back to claim its due? The story of Blackridge is just beginning. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell because you won't want to miss what happens when the truth finally comes to light. Thanks for watching. If he didn't die there, then where is he? The question settled over the field like a storm cloud that refused to move. No one rushed to answer. And for the first time in 15 years, the people of Blackridge realized their silence was no longer protection, it was evidence. Walter Briggs finally removed his hat, his hands trembling slightly, and said there was an old silver mine 5 miles west of town, abandoned after a collapse decades ago. The mayor tried to interrupt, but the words came too late. Once a secret begins to open, it does not close easily. Aaron listened without blinking as the truth slowly pushed its way out of men who had convinced themselves they were justified. His father, Sheriff Thomas Hawley, had uncovered missing county funds, illegal land seizures, and falsified tax records. He had been preparing arrest warrants. He had mailed documents to state authorities. The hanging, they admitted, was meant to frighten him into leaving, but fear had turned into chaos. The rope had snapped during the drop, the platform had splintered. And his father had hit the ground hard. He was unconscious but alive. That single detail drained the color from Aaron's face. They had checked for breathing, Walter insisted, but only briefly. Panic had already taken over. If Sheriff Hawley recovered, he would expose everything. If the state arrived, prison awaited all of them. So instead of calling for help, they loaded him into a truck under cover of the fire they set to destroy the gallows. While the town watched flames light up the night sky, 5 men drove into the hills. The Silver Ridge mine had been unstable for years. Locals avoided it out of superstition and fear. Inside the first chamber, they laid the unconscious sheriff near a fractured shaft and told themselves he would not survive until morning. They sealed part of the entrance with loose rock and debris before leaving him in the dark. Aaron did not shout. He did not lunge at anyone. His calmness was heavier than rage. He did not lunge at anyone. His calmness was heavier than rage. Was he breathing when you left? He asked quietly. Aaron did not shout. He did not lunge at anyone. His calmness was heavier than rage. Was he breathing when you left? He asked quietly. If his father had been alive in that mine, then the story was no longer about corruption alone, it was about something far worse. Why didn't the state... If his father had been alive in that mine, then the story was no longer about corruption alone, it was about something far worse. Why didn't the state investigators come? Aaron asked. The mayor admitted they intercepted the mail and burned what they could find. If his father had been alive in that mine, then the story was no longer about corruption alone, it was about something far worse. Why didn't the state investigators come? Aaron asked. The mayor admitted they intercepted the mail and burned what they could find. Some of the townspeople began asking questions of their own now about land transfers from 15 years ago, about relatives who had mysteriously moved away, about debts that had never made sense. The unity that once protected the 5 men was beginning about relatives who had mysteriously moved away, about debts that had never made sense. The unity that once protected the 5 men was beginning to fracture. Aaron walked back toward his truck and paused only once, turning to face them again. If there's anything else you're hiding, he said. This is your last chance to say it before I start digging into more than dirt. No one spoke. The hills stood silent in the distance, their rocky ridges cutting into the gray morning sky. Aaron started the engine and drove west, tires crunching over gravel. More than dirt. No one spoke. The hills stood silent in the distance, their rocky ridges cutting into the gray morning sky. Aaron started the engine and drove west, tires crunching over gravel, leaving behind a town that suddenly felt smaller and far less certain of itself. Aaron stepped out of the truck and stared at the collapsed opening. If the confession was true, then somewhere beyond that barrier of rock and dust lay the final moments of Sheriff Thomas Hawley, and if his father had regained consciousness in that darkness, even for a few minutes, then the mine did not just hold remains, it held the last unfinished fight of a man who had refused to look away from corruption. Aaron picked up a crowbar from the truck bed and approached the entrance slowly. Behind him, a second vehicle appeared on the road, then a third. Word had spread. Blackridge was coming to watch what they had tried to forget. Aaron placed the crowbar against the first loose stone and pulled. Rock shifted. Dust fell. The sound echoed faintly from within the mountain, deep and hollow, like something stirring after a long sleep. He paused, listening. The wind had stopped again. The air felt heavier here. And as another stone gave way, opening a narrow darkness beyond, Aaron felt a certainty settle inside him. Whatever truth waited inside, that mine was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be quiet. Aaron stepped into the mine without looking back, and the darkness swallowed him faster than he expected. The temperature dropped immediately, and the air carried the stale, heavy weight of 15 undisturbed years. His flashlight beam cut through the black, stretching across rough stone walls and broken timber supports, revealing a tunnel that sloped downward into a wider, darker chamber. Every step he took echoed differently here, heavier, as if the mountain itself remembered what had been left inside it. The past felt alive in this place, a silent witness to a terrible secret. He imagined the night his father had been brought here, unconscious, grievously injured, surrounded by men too afraid of prison to choose mercy. The thought hardened something inside him, a cold knot of anger tightening in his gut. But he forced himself to stay steady, to breathe through the rage. Anger could make you careless, and carelessness inside a mind could kill you faster than guilt ever could. As he moved deeper into the oppressive silence, his light caught something on the floor. Scuffed rock, faint drag patterns preserved in the dry dust, leading toward a partially sealed shaft. This was no natural collapse. The stones had been stacked deliberately, layered with a desperate urgency rather than precision. He set down his crowbar and began removing the rocks one by one. Each scrape echoed sharply in the confined chamber, a sound that felt both too loud and not loud enough. Outside, the distant, muffled voices of the townspeople drifted faintly through the entrance, a reminder of the world he had left behind. But inside this tomb, the world had narrowed to just three things: his breathing, the cold stone, and the suffocating weight of memory. When he had cleared enough of the rock, a narrow gap revealed a lower cavity, partially protected by a large, fallen beam. Aaron widened the opening carefully. The dust of 15 years clinging to him, and slid down into the shaft. He landed unevenly on a bed of gravel and fractured timber, his hand trembling just slightly. The beam settled on skeletal remains, positioned beneath the angled support beam, as if reaching toward a light that never came. His throat tightened, a wave of grief threatening to pull him under. But he forced himself to move closer, to see what had to be seen. The bones were partially shielded from the worst of the collapse, preserved by the same dry air that had preserved the truth all these years. Beside the remains stood a rusted lantern. It was placed upright, not toppled, not smashed, but carefully positioned. Aaron crouched beside it and touched the valve gently. It was fully closed, not burned, empty closed. That meant someone had turned it off. Someone had been here after the initial sealing of the shaft. His pulse began to pound in his ears. Not from grief, but from a sudden, chilling realization. Near the ribcage, partially trapped beneath stone, was a leather-bound notebook. It was compressed by debris, but somehow still intact. Aaron lifted it carefully, brushing away the dust from the cover before opening it. The first pages were written in a shaky, strained handwriting he recognized instantly. It was his father's. Still breathing, leg broken. Can hear them arguing. Each line was short, deliberate, a stark and powerful proof of survival. His father had regained consciousness in this suffocating darkness. He had known what they had done to him. Further down the page, the entries became weaker, the writing fainter, but still determined. Lantern half fuel. Trying to shift rock. Then, the final line written in his father's hand. If anyone finds this, corruption runs deeper than 5 men. Aaron felt the chamber tilt slightly around him as he turned the page. He wasn't prepared for what he saw next. Beneath that last entry, written in a steadier, different handwriting, were words that froze him completely. Thomas Hale was not alone. The ink looked newer than the earlier entries, but it was still old years old. Someone else had entered this shaft after his father, the sheriff. Someone had found him alive long enough to read his notebook, or at least long enough to add their own cryptic message to it. Aaron scanned the walls with his flashlight, his heart hammering against his ribs. Near the shaft entrance, he saw it. A small, carved star etched into the stone, identical to the subtle star engraved inside his father's badge, a private mark few people knew about. His mind raced, piecing it all together. His father had not been isolated in his knowledge. He had been part of something larger. Tucked into the back cover of the notebook, Aaron discovered a folded scrap of paper. On it were coordinates and a unit number in Cheyenne. A storage facility. Evidence. Tucked into the back cover of the notebook, Aaron discovered a folded scrap of paper. On it were coordinates and a unit number in Cheyenne. A storage facility. Evidence. Stored away from Blackridge, away from prying eyes. That was why the state investigators never came up with anything. Hard clarity. This mine had not simply been a grave. It had been a pause, a single brutal chapter in a much larger investigation. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from above. Deputy Mark Ellis was cautiously entering the chamber. But when Aaron showed him the final page of the notebook, Mark's expression broke into visible, unadulterated fear. Adulterated fear. "We never came back," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. But the closed lantern valve and the added handwriting in the notebook proved otherwise. Someone had returned. Either to confirm a death or to retrieve something, and in their haste, they had left evidence behind by mistake. Aaron carefully closed the notebook and stood, shining the light one last time over the remains of his father. He felt sorrow, yes, a deep and profound sorrow. But stronger than the sorrow was certainty. The 5 men in town who had confessed were only part of the story. If the corruption ran deeper than them, then Blackridge was just a branch, not the root. He climbed back toward the entrance slowly, the notebook secured safely inside his coat. The remains of his father. He felt sorrow, yes, a deep and profound sorrow. But stronger than the sorrow was certainty. The 5 men in town who had confessed were only part of the story. If the corruption ran deeper than them, then Blackridge was just a branch, not the root. He climbed back toward the entrance slowly, the notebook secured safely inside his coat. Clouds rolling in as if summoned by the shifting balance of truth. Aaron looked west toward the highway that led to Cheyenne and understood that this mine, this grave, was only. Aaron looked west toward the highway that led to Cheyenne and understood that this mine, this grave, was only the beginning. Whatever his father had uncovered had survived beyond Blackridge, stored carefully, waiting for someone willing to finish what had been started. And as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Aaron realized something else that sent a deeper chill through him. The person who had written that final line in the notebook, the person who knew his father wasn't alone, might still be alive, and they might be waiting for him. Thanks for watching. If you want to see how this story unfolds, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We're just getting started. The storm rolled in as Aaron left Blackridge behind, the western sky turning a deep steel gray that mirrored the weight pressing against his chest. The notebook rested on the passenger seat beside him, its cracked leather cover hiding 15 years of silence and a final message that changed everything. The coordinates written inside led to a storage facility in Cheyenne, and every mile of highway between the mine and the city felt like a bridge between 2 different versions of the same story. Blackridge had believed the mountains sealed the truth, but the mountain had only protected it long enough for someone else to find it. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, rows of metal doors lined up like sealed confessions. He stepped out into the cold rain, walked to the office, and presented the unit number written on the scrap of paper. The clerk searched the system, paused, and then looked up with a puzzled expression. In cash. No name attached beyond a simple alias. Aaron felt something steady and powerful settle inside him. His father had planned for betrayal long before it arrived. The metal door screeched as it rolled upward. Inside, under a thin layer of dust, were sealed file boxes, a locked briefcase, and a small fireproof safe. Aaron stepped into the unit slowly, almost reverently, as if entering the final chapter of a story his father had refused to let end. He opened the first box and found copies of land deeds, altered tax records, and correspondence linking Blackridge officials to a larger development company that had quietly acquired properties across 3 counties. The corruption was not just local embezzlement. It was coordinated land seizure designed to push families off valuable acreage before a major mineral survey was made public. His father had uncovered an organized effort, not 5 desperate men acting alone. Aaron opened the briefcase next. Inside were recorded statements on old digital drives and a typed report addressed to the Wyoming State Attorney General, never delivered. As he read, the scale became undeniable. Black Ridge was a test town. If the land acquisition worked quietly there, it would expand. The 5 men had not been masterminds. They had been beneficiaries and enforcers. The final document in the case was a sworn statement signed by someone Aaron did not expect. Deputy Mark Ellis, dated 3 days before the hanging. In it, Mark admitted knowledge of falsified records and agreed to testify if granted protection. Aaron felt the air shift in his lungs. Mark had intended to turn on them before fear swallowed him whole. At the bottom of the stack was a final envelope labeled simply, "If I dawn to make it." Aaron opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in his father's steady hand. The words were calm, not desperate. He wrote that justice is not loud at first, it waits. He wrote that truth sometimes survives by hiding. And he wrote that if Aaron was reading this, then the fight was not over, it had only changed hands. There was no anger in the letter. Only certainty that eventually someone would finish what he started. Aaron closed the safe and stepped back into the rain, phone already in his hand. This time, the call to the state attorney general's office would not be intercepted. Digital copies were transmitted before anyone in Black Ridge knew he had opened the unit. Within hours, state investigators contacted him directly. Within days, marked vehicles rolled into Black Ridge not as rumor, but as authority. Search warrants were issued, financial records seized. The development company executives, once distant and insulated, suddenly found themselves answering questions they thought had been buried with a sheriff in a mine. Back in town, the atmosphere shifted from denial to reckoning. The mayor attempted resignation before arrest. Walter Briggs and Simon Crowley were taken into custody without resistance. Pastor Whitmore confessed publicly before charges were filed. His voice shaking as he admitted fear had guided him more than faith. And Mark Ellis, confronted with the rediscovered sworn statement bearing his own signature, finally chose to testify fully, not out of courage this time but because silence no longer protected anyone. Aaron returned to the mine once more before the official recovery team arrived. He stood at the entrance as professionals carefully secured the site, ensuring his father would be brought out with dignity instead of secrecy. The storm had passed, leaving the hills washed clean under a pale morning sky. He did not feel triumph. He felt completion. The truth had not exploded dramatically. It had unfolded patiently, piece by piece, exactly as his father predicted. Weeks later, a formal funeral was held in Black Ridge. This time the crowd gathered not out of curiosity or fear, but respect. Sheriff Thomas Hale's badge was polished and restored, the carved star inside visible only to those who knew where to look. Aaron stood before the town and spoke without bitterness. He told them corruption survives when good people convince themselves silence is safer. He told them fear can disguise itself as practicality. And he told them that justice does not disappear, it waits for someone willing to dig. After the burial, Aaron walked alone to the northern field where the gallows once stood. The ground was quiet now, grass beginning to grow where burned wood had once been hidden. He knelt and pressed his hand into the soil, not in anger, but in acknowledgement. The town had tried to erase a man. Instead, they exposed themselves. As he stood to leave, he noticed something unexpected. Several townspeople were already dismantling what remained of the old foundation stones, not to hide them again, but to build a small memorial marker. No rope, no platform, just a plaque that read, "Truth does not stay buried." Aaron drove out of Black Ridge for the final time as sunset painted the hills gold. The fight his father started had reached beyond one town and exposed a network that would face years of investigation. But what mattered most was simpler than headlines or arrests. A lie that lasted 15 years had finally run out of ground. And as the highway stretched ahead into the open Wyoming sky, Aaron realized something steady and certain. They hadn't buried a secret under the gallows. They had buried the man who refused to become one. Thanks for joining us for this entire journey. If you appreciate stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We'll see you in the next one.